Rusted metal husks dotted the endless plain of cracked earth. Once these hulking skeletons had been vehicles, vital arteries for bustling trade and travel. Now, they were silent reminders of a time when life was not an unrelenting contest for survival. The sky above burned a punishing white, as though the sun itself wanted to scour the land of every living thing. Gnawing winds stirred dust that peppered the air, stinging eyes and clinging to parched throats. Those who dared wander across these wastes did so at great risk, for warlords held the territory like a vice. Amid the wreckage, makeshift camps sprouted, shanty towns of corrugated iron and tattered canvas, fluttering like ragged wounds. The few unlucky souls who lived there sorted through rubble for scraps, while children learned to operate rifles before they learned to read. Leon was one of those children. At 13, she had long outgrown tears or the false promise of innocence. Her world was governed by two bleak truths: obey or die. She was born into war and didn't know any other way to live. Her father had once been a scavenger, part of a roving crew that eked out a living sifting through the debris for anything to barter. Her mother she barely remembered. The warlord Kazran's men arrived one scorching day, rounding up every able person in the settlement. Leon's father fell fighting, while she and a dozen other children were conscripted on the spot. She now belonged to the regiment of child soldiers who slept under the hot tarps of Kazran's fortress. Their boots were made of rotting leather that scuffed the cracked soil. Bullets, hammered into worn belts, jangled with every step they took. Nights were filled with the thunderous rattle of machinery and the flicker of fires that lit the horizon. By day they marched, studied weaponry, and practiced drills. The older ones also learned how to fix vehicles. Parts were scavenged from the battered remains on the dunes. In this place of constant violence, one learned that not even the faintest smile or a gentle gesture went unnoticed. A small kindness could draw suspicion from the overseers, who doled out punishments for reasons as simple as a whispered laugh or an extra gulp of water. One morning, the clanging of metal rods against iron plates awoke the camp. Orders barked from the general's tent. "Form up. Patrol squads must move out before noon." Leon found herself in the third squad, though the difference between the squads was immaterial. There was no camaraderie, only the shared weight of exhaustion and fear. If you froze in training, you would be beaten. If you fell behind on the march, you might be left behind. Even the smallest sign of insubordination could lead to dreadful consequences. Sleep eluded them. Memories haunted every quiet moment, but those memories were fading into abstract shapes. The faces of loved ones, half-remembered lullabies, and the shadows of toys left behind in a world that no longer existed. The warlord Kazran ruled a territory he called Ember's Reach, though legend claimed it was once part of a thriving realm with green fields. A generation ago, an unnamed cataclysm tore the skies asunder and left the land barren. Over time, men like Kazran rose from the rubble. They claimed pieces of the territory with barbed wire and bullets, forging alliances when it served them and slaughtering entire settlements when it did not. His closest rivals, Haro, Chesik, and Malik were just as brutal. Sometimes they formed pacts, only to betray each other within a week. Children were commonly used as soldiers, numerous, easily manipulated, and capable of pressing a trigger. In this scorched world, humility had no place. Virtue was a liability. The mark of adulthood arrived the moment you learned to kill without trembling. But there were murmurs in the camp of a resistance led by the mysterious figure known only as the Lantern Bearer. Rumors claimed that the Lantern Bearer wandered the desert at night, guiding runaways and shells of old caravans to places safer than here. Of course, it was difficult to imagine any place truly safe. And yet, Leon found herself lying awake during rare quiet moments, wondering whether such a figure actually existed. She sometimes dared to hope for rescue, or for someone who would overthrow Kazran and free them all. She felt a twinge of shame and fear whenever such thoughts passed her mind, for hope in this place was a dangerous thing. On a day hotter than most, the children disassembled and cleaned their rifles in the yard, aside from the fort's main gates. Flies buzzed over muddy rivulets of wastewater. Great steel drums collected the scarce rainfall, and near them a handful of older child soldiers practiced with battered knives. The whine of a faulty generator stuttered in the background. The dryness in Leon's throat was relentless. Each breath she took felt like an ember lodged in her lungs. If a child flinched or stopped to wipe sweat from their brow, a guard would jab at them with a baton. Leon knew how to endure. She kept her eyes on her work, disassembling the rifle until every part gleamed with oil, then reassembling it swiftly, each movement etched into muscle memory. An alarm suddenly blared. Soldiers snapped to attention, training rifles replaced with loaded ones, safety catches undone. A messenger panted at the gate, shouting, "Raiders from Harrow's territory are on the horizon." Fear and tension collided in the yard. Even the overseers, who relished terrorizing the children, seemed unnerved. They barked at everyone to form lines and wait for orders. Within moments, Khazran himself strode out from the fortress with a half-dozen adult bodyguards to accompany him. He was massive, clad in a patchwork of armor plates hammered from old car doors. His face was a grim mask behind a tinted visor, and a heavy rifle with a serrated bayonet hung from his shoulder. He scanned the ranks of child soldiers, pausing on Leon for a fraction of a second. He pointed toward the outer walls. "All squads, arm yourselves, keep watch. If Harrow's scum get too close, we blast them to dust. Show no fear." His voice resonated, laced with malice. The children fanned out, climbing onto crude watchtowers. The towers swayed precariously in the strong wind, rust gnawing at their supports. From her vantage point high above the scorched plain, Leon spotted plumes of dust in the distance. Raider vehicles, battered trucks, or perhaps motorcycles swarming across the dunes. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, though her hands kept a steady grip on the rifle stock. The stoic face of her father flickered in her mind, and she squelched the thought before it paralyzed her. Those vehicles never advanced. Whether it was a feint or if they simply ran low on fuel, they turned back, leaving swirling dust in their wake. Khazran relaxed his stance, signaled the children to stand down, and retired to a nearby hut with his advisors. Yet the sense of foreboding did not fade. The children whispered among themselves, exchanging glances that spoke more than words could. As the sun dipped beneath the horizon, the yard's floodlights sputtered to life. Leon felt an unspoken dread. The desert night brought both chilling cold and the possibility of more raids. She hadn't been allowed to wander beyond the gates. She never saw how the world looked at night, free from the fortress's watchlight. All she knew was the sharp clang of corrugated fences, the suffocating presence of other conscripts in cramped sleeping quarters, and the raw stench of unwashed clothes. At the day's end, she lay on a thin mat beside hardened kids who looked half her age, but had eyes as hollow as any adult. Sleep came in fitful snatches. Her dreams, if one could call them that, conjured broken images, storms of dust swallowing entire cities, a fallen tower in the distance, and the faint flicker of a lantern across the dunes. The next morning brought fresh orders, a supply run to the southwestern ruins, rumored to hold hidden caches of bullets, fuel, and medicine. Leon was assigned to the convoy, the first time she'd be leaving Khazran's fortress since she arrived. The convoy consisted of 2 salvaged trucks, each bristling with corrugated iron plating. Bars replaced windows. Children would man the turrets, while adult guards produced a looming presence in the back with heavier weaponry. There were always adult guards. Not enough for all-out fighting, but enough to keep the children in line. Desertion was punishable by summary execution. Everyone knew it. They set out under a pale sky. Gritty wind whipped at the trucks, forcing them to weave around rubble heaps. As they rumbled across the cracked earth, Leon kept her eyes on the horizon. Towering silhouettes of broken skyscrapers rose in the distance, relics of a city that once reached for the heavens. Now they stood crooked, as though trying to limp away from the scorching sun. With a jolt, the trucks rolled into a labyrinth of debris. Charred vehicles cluttered the streets. Rusted scaffolding blocked the narrower passages, and entire sections of collapsed buildings formed mountains of scrap. The squad leader, an adult named Brigg, signaled a halt beneath a half-toppled overpass. "Search these blocks for anything we can use. Fuel, water filters, ammo, medicine," he barked. His voice echoed through the deserted roads. Soldiers fanned out in groups of 2 or 3, always with at least one older child or adult present to keep watch. Leon paired with a girl named Evo, who was no older than 12, but had the eyes of someone who'd long stopped believing in anything but survival. Together, they edged into the skeleton of a looted pharmacy. Shelves were upended, plastic bottles littered the floor, and the faint smell of mold clung to the walls. Dull sunlight filtered through a gaping hole in the ceiling. Ivo motioned for silence, inspecting a corner. A battered metal cabinet was wedged against the wall, perhaps overlooked by scavengers in a hurry. Leon stood guard by the door as Ivo pried it open with the butt of her rifle. A few crinkled boxes slid onto the debris-littered floor. Some bandages, a small bottle of antiseptic, partially used syringes. The desperation of their situation was clear. These scraps could mean the difference between life and death, but they were barely enough to fill a satchel. Boiling wind hissed through shattered windows. Leanne raised her rifle, heart pounding. She thought she heard footsteps outside, but it could have been only the shifting rubble. Still, she wasn't going to let her guard down. Her voice came out in a trembling whisper. "We should get these supplies to Brig." Evo nodded, stuffing the bandages and antiseptic into her patchwork bag. Then a sudden sputter of motor noise made them freeze. They ducked behind a crumbled counter as a creaking truck rolled past the open doorway. Emblazoned on its side was a symbol not of Kazran, but of another warlord, Tresix. It seemed the city was no man's land, or perhaps multiple warlords had staked overlapping claims. Further away, it meant trouble. Outside shouts erupted. Gunfire crackled sharply, ricocheting off shattered walls. The 2 girls exchanged alarmed looks. They scrambled across the pharmacy, trying to find a back exit. The only path was buried by fallen beams. Leanne realized they were trapped, unless they dared to dart across the street in full view of Tresix raiders. Ivo's face twisted with fear. Another volley of bullets rattled the street. Leanne clenched her jaw, forced her trembling legs to move, and signaled to Ivo to follow. They sprinted out the doorway, crouched low. The street was chaos. Briggs' truck was pinned behind the remains of a burnt-out bus, smoke funneling from a shot-out tire. Tresix raiders, clad in mismatched armor, fired from behind abandoned cars. The exchange of gunfire whirled dust and rubble into a frenzy. Nearby, a child soldier stumbled, clutching a wound in his arm. Leanne and Evo pressed themselves against a chunk of concrete, hearts hammering. They counted only 3 or 4 of Tresix's men, an adult and some older adolescents with grim expressions. Yet the environment gave them cover and vantage points. Kazran's side wasn't faring well. Brig bellowed for them to fall back to the trucks. The directive was simpler said than done. Rounds snapped overhead, chipping away at the concrete. When Leanne glimpsed an opening, she shouted at Evo to run. They dashed into the open, reaching the truck's flank just as the leader from Tresix's group hurled a makeshift grenade. The explosion lifted the bus wreck onto its side with a thunderous crash. Metal shards zipped through the air. The shockwave threw Leanne to the ground, her ears ringing. It took her a moment to stagger upright, head pounding. Blood dripped from a shallow gash on her arm. A hand yanked her roughly. It was Brig, his face contorted with rage. His rifle was nearly out of ammo. "Get in the truck, you worthless runt!" he screamed over the din. Leanne scrambled into the back of the truck, helping Evo pull herself up. The driver slammed on the gas, but the engine coughed before roaring back to life. With a painful lurch, the vehicle sped away from the ambush, weaving through side streets. A second truck followed, black smoke chugging from its exhaust. 2 of Kazran's adult fighters lay stilled in the rubble behind, unreachable. By the time they reached a safer section of the city, Tresix's raiders had vanished back into the ruins. The remnants of the convoy regrouped in a deserted lot. A battered sign overhead read Community Center, the letters half erased by time. Brig cursed furiously, examining the supplies they'd managed to scavenge. It was meager, certainly not worth the blood spilled. The warlord Kazran would not be pleased. His wrath would doubtless land on the children who failed to secure enough. Leanne felt a mix of relief at having survived and dread at what awaited them. She touched her wounded arm gingerly, wincing at the sting. Her reflection swam in a cracked rear-view mirror on the truck. Dirt and sweat smeared her face, and her eyes looked far older than 13. They spent the night huddled in the shelled remains of the community center, posting guards in shifts. Despite her exhaustion, Leon found little rest. Anxiety roiled in her stomach. Briefly, in the hush of midnight, she sneaked away from the group to gather her breath in solitude. She perched behind a crumbled wall and looked over the city's silent silhouette. The moon was a pale disk in the sky. For once, the fortress's oppressive lights were well out of sight. She listened to the wind moaning through the broken windows. Something moved in the corner of her vision and she stiffened, hand creeping to her rifle. But it was only a battered signpost clattering in the breeze. Still, she sensed a presence. A faint glow flickered between two collapsed apartment buildings. She stared, heart fluttering. It was too small and steady to be gunfire or a reflection. Was it a lamp? Some movement suggested a shape carrying that glow. She blinked, uncertain if her eyes were playing tricks on her. The strange figure disappeared as abruptly as it appeared, leaving a lingering sense of wonder. Could it have been the lantern-bearer of rumors? She'd never paid those stories much heed, dismissing them as desperate folk tales. Yet for the first time in as long as she could recall, she felt a tiny ember of hope. Morning arrived, cold and cheerless. The convoy rolled out immediately, anxious to leave the city's haunted confines. They returned, battered and exhausted, to Kazran's fortress by midday. The Warlord's displeasure was swift. He berated Brig and systematically singled out child soldiers to blame, threatening them with his brutality. 2 children were dragged away to the punishment pit. No one ever returned from there unscarred. The savage demonstration reminded everyone of their place. They cowered before Kazran's rage, hearts pounding. Leon glanced at Evo, who kept her eyes locked on the ground. Days bled into weeks. Skirmishes persisted. Raids, counters, stealth attacks on outposts. Children were tossed onto the front line or used as lookouts in the watchtowers. Casualties mounted, and no one was safe from Kazran's sadistic mood swings. A rumor spread that one of Kazran's captains planned to defect to a rival, but the scheme was exposed. Kazran ordered the captain executed in front of the children, a public spectacle meant to quash any flicker of rebellion. Leon felt nauseated seeing her fellow child soldiers forced to watch. This was the future that awaited any perceived traitor. One sweltering afternoon, while retrieving water from the communal drum, Leon encountered an older boy named Rook, who had shown her small kindness in the past. He nodded slightly, offering a subtle word of reassurance. They whispered about the rumored lantern-bearer, the possibility of sneaking away under cover of night. "I've heard that he helps those who dare to leave, guiding them across the wasteland," Rook murmured. "I'm tempted to try. Anything is better than this." The idea of desertion made Leon tremble. The punishments were brutal, and the desert was no kinder, but hope for a chance of freedom smoldered like a dying coal in her chest. The opportunity came unexpectedly. Haru's warband launched a massive assault on the fortress after sundown, utilizing improvised mortars and a savage flanking maneuver. Caught off guard, Kazran's forces scrambled to repel them. The night was lit by bursts of gunfire and the orange glow of flaming barricades. Alarms shrieked, and the children were herded into defensive lines. Leon clutched her battered rifle, fear coiled in her gut. But as the chaos grew, she realized the watch on the eastern perimeter was thinner than usual. Perhaps, in the confusion, there wouldn't be enough guards to notice a few missing children slipping away. She found Rook near the armory, gesturing anxiously for her to follow him. She hesitated, scanning the raging battlefield. Flames danced across the courtyard, flickering over twisted metal. The sound of screaming melted into the thunder of machine guns. One chance, now or never. Ivo appeared, as if from nowhere, eyes filled with desperation. The 3 kids shared a look, weighed the terror of the unknown desert against continuing enslavement. Wordlessly, they made the choice. They crept behind bent fence posts, hearts crashing in their chests. Twice, they nearly ran headlong into patrolling guards, but the roiling smoke offered cover. Each second threatened discovery. Bullets whizzed overhead, and the fortress gates crackled under mortar fire. Lien winced at the haunting images of other children forced to the front line. But there was no time for regret. Survival demanded cold choices. They reached a gap in the corroded fence and squeezed through. 200 yards of no man's land separated them from the dunes. Torn fragments of barbed wire had to be carefully avoided. Gunshots rang out from the ramparts, but no shouts of alarm singled out their escape. The fortress was too consumed by its own desperate defense. Once they cleared the outer perimeter, they sank into the gloom beyond the flickering lights. A savage wind whipped their hair and clothes. Rook checked the horizon for threats. No pursuit, at least not yet. Evo gasped in relief, tears glistening at the corners of her eyes. Lion swallowed hard, scanning the charred expanse. Freed from the suffocating glow of the fortress lights, the stars flared overhead like scattered shards of broken glass. The desert's emptiness felt monstrous, yet also eerily peaceful. They couldn't stay in one spot. Fear of patrolling vehicles spurred them forward. Step by step they advanced into the unknown. Sand hissed underfoot, each breath stung with dryness. They followed the faint ridge of a ruined highway, hoping it might lead them somewhere with water. Occasionally they paused to listen, expecting the roar of truck engines behind them. But all that answered was the restless wind. At midnight, with the moon overhead, Lien thought she spotted a faint glow in the distance, much like the one she'd seen in the old city. She asked Rook and Ivo if they saw it too. Rook squinted, uncertain, but Ivo insisted she did. Together, they trudged toward it, half disbelieving their own eyes. The glow bobbed along, at times disappearing behind dunes before flickering back into view. They pressed on for what felt like hours, battered by the wind, exhaustion gnawing at their will. At last, they crested a rise of sand and saw a figure standing near a crooked signpost. The figure held a lantern, an actual lantern, glass panels flickering with a warm flame inside. Garbed in a dark cloak that billowed in the wind, the being's face was largely hidden, revealing only the suggestion of strong, weathered features. The figure raised the lantern slightly, beckoning them forward. Lien felt her pulse flow. She sensed no threat in this stranger, only a gentle presence that filled the emptiness. She wondered if this was truly the legendary lantern bearer or just another desert outcast bearing a light. Without speaking, the figure guided them down the far side of the dune, into a hidden ravine that smelled faintly of moisture. There, trickling from a cracked granite stone, was a tiny spring of water, practically a miracle in this wasteland. Children, trembling with both awe and relief, refilled canteens they'd scavenged. The stranger watched in silence, then pointed with one gloved hand toward a direction deeper into the desert. A subtle nod seemed to tell them they must keep moving. Evo managed a trembling question. "What? Who are you? Why are you helping us?" The figure said nothing, only turned slightly so the lantern's light fell upon a rocky trail that snaked away into the darkness. Then, a voice, low and steady, broke the hush. "They call me the lantern bearer. There are others waiting. Keep to this path for 6 nights. Watch for my light if you lose your way." The accent was impossible to place, as though they'd lived a lifetime traveling among the desert tribes. Could they trust this? Yet, in a world so calcified by cruelty, kindness was not easy to fake. The children shared an unspoken understanding that any refuge was worth trying for. They murmured their gratitude, voice quavering. The lantern bearer moved with fluid grace, leading them along the winding path for a while longer. Then, at a fork in the ravine, the figure pressed a small, battered compass into Rook's hand and whispered, "Go south when the sun rises. At dawn, hide in gullies if the war parties pass overhead. If you stay resolute, you'll find safety." Those words, almost otherworldly in tone, resonated deep within Lien. She bit her lip, grappling with the flood of emotion surging through her battered heart. Gratitude, hope, and a lingering fear that this might be too good to be true. If it wasn't, if true sanctuary lay ahead, perhaps all this bloodshed and all the horrors she'd endured wouldn't be the sum of her life. Soon after, the lantern bearer departed, taking the glow with them into the gloom. The children were left under the cold canopy of stars, newly invigorated. They followed the instructions as best they could, forging ahead through the desert nights and seeking shelter during the sweltering day. Their progress was slow but steady. On the third day, they narrowly avoided a scouting patrol from Tressick camouflaging themselves beneath mud-caked tarps. On the fifth night, water nearly ran out, but they discovered a half-buried cistern with a trickle of muddy water. Each moment tested their resolve, yet the idea that a different future might exist propelled them. At last, on the sixth night, cresting a rise littered with rebar and chunks of asphalt, they glimpsed something remarkable, a secret encampment nestled in a sheltered canyon, its perimeter lit by lanterns and small fires. Children and adults walked openly, unencumbered by the cruelty of warlords. They wore patched clothes and carried weapons, yes, but their eyes held a cautious compassion rather than despair. As Lion, Rook, and Evo approached, they were greeted without hostility. Several figures rushed to assist them, offering cups of water and blankets. A soft voice said, "Welcome. The lantern bearers said you'd be coming." A wave of trembling relief nearly crumpled Lion's knees. Under the flickering lamplight, she saw the faces of those who had escaped the warlords, forging a fragile community in the remotest corner of the desert. She recognized the hardened lines in their expressions, signs of endured torment, but also saw the spark of defiance and solidarity that she never thought possible. In hushed tones, they explained that they aimed to rescue children conscripted by the warlords, teaching them how to care for each other, how to farm in hidden pockets of fertile land, and how to defend themselves if necessary. They lacked resources in abundance, but they shared what they had. Over time, more runaways would join them, guided by the lantern bearer in the dead of night. Sitting by a fire, Leon finally allowed herself a moment to believe that this might be real. The memory of Kezran's fortress still loomed, a vicious place, bristling with child soldiers who might never know freedom. Tears streaked her cheeks. She thought of the bloodshed, the endless drilling, the cruel punishments. It had seemed unstoppable, an eternal nightmare. But here, the children of war gathered around subdued flames, forging something that smelled like hope. This was not the end of their struggles. The desert was vast, the warlords still reigned, and tomorrow might bring new dangers. However, for the first time in Lien's life, that tomorrow also carried the possibility of choice, of growing beyond the role of a disposable foot soldier. She glanced at Rook and Evo, who were wrapped in blankets, eyes alight with cautious optimism. Never had a simple drink of water or a shared smile seemed so precious. Looking at the ragged group that called this canyon home, Lien realized that they were not alone in their desire for change. On the far side of the embers, she saw the lantern bearer conversing quietly with a few refugees. The figure's lantern was unlit now, resting on a nearby rock. The risk they took each night to guide lost souls here was extraordinary. And yet, from the lantern-bearer's calm demeanor, it seemed a duty willingly embraced. In the hushed dark, as the wind hummed through the canyon, Lien felt something stirring inside her. They were indeed children of war, shaped by violence and fear, yet they also possessed a resolve to reclaim their destinies. One day, they might return to topple the warlords' bastions. Or perhaps they would focus on saving as many children as they could from that grim, scorched existence. The future was uncertain, but it was now theirs to shape for now. The strangled cry of nightmares would give way to the glimmer of dawn. Lien closed her eyes, breathing in the quiet warmth of the campfire. She remembered her father's whispered promise from a lifetime ago. One day, we'll find peace. She thought it had been a lie. But now, though scarred and weary, she believed it was still something worth fighting for.